Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often, it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
Each bit of information delivers that to the whole jigsaw.
I was able to test that sample and I got a DNA profile.
There's no doubt at all that forensics were absolutely crucial in this case.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science were able to bring some of our most dangerous and despicable killers to justice.
This was such an unnatural crime.
It's not a question of if he will kill again, it's a question of when.
He believed that he was invincible and that nothing could stop him.
We'll hear how some of the toughest and most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
When you begin a forensic investigation, you don't know what you're going to find.
The officer plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
From the type of insects that were around, she'd been dead for at least 5 years.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man.
In this episode, a young woman's murderer eludes capture for decades.
The community just went into shock.
But it's a case detectives refuse to let lie.
You hear of people talk about old cases being closed. They're never closed.
And a revolutionary forensic technique allows them to finally trace the killer.
So there we had it the first time. Now we've got a possible name of a possible offender.
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer.
This village, just on the south of Nottingham, mixed development, council estates, some quite posh houses, mixture of commuters, professional people, working people.
In 1983, Keyworth was a small, normal village few people outside of South Nottinghamshire would have heard of. But the events on the night of 30th October would change that forever.
This whole community is just taken over by the police activity, by the media activity, by the attention, and it tends to send a community like that into shock.
That shock was caused by the disappearance of 16-year-old trainee hairdresser Colette Aram. Rod Chater, a newspaper reporter covering the Midlands patch in the early 80s, remembers the story breaking.
This is, you know, a respectable, nice kid next door, and something absolutely terrible has happened to her. The story that emerged from the police was that Colette had gone to see her boyfriend the previous night, and in one of those twists, and there always does seem to be one of those tragic twists, in a sense it shouldn't have happened, because under normal circumstances her boyfriend would have collected her and driven her the 1.5 miles to his house, but his car was off the road. 8 o'clock at night, late October, it's dark, but she sees some friends at about 8:10, passes a word with them, turns, and moments later, they and others hear terrible screams, female screams. The police think, everybody thinks those witnesses heard her being abducted. Some stories just do penetrate the national psyche. They just bury themselves in the national consciousness, and they just become huge. Reporters descending on the area, national reporters, TV crews, everybody, I mean, you just know You just do know when it's a big tale, and this was clearly going to be a big tale, and everything that developed after that reinforced that.
In the early 1980s, the memories of the Yorkshire Ripper still hung over the country. Could something similar have happened in sleepy Keyworth? In less than 24 hours, the friends, family and police officers now searching for Colette would have their answer. Kevin Flint was a young detective sergeant with Nottinghamshire Constabulary at the time Colette disappeared.
So on the Monday morning, there was a local man who was driving from Keyworth towards Weissel at about 9 o'clock in the morning. And as he travelled along Thirlby Lane, he saw Colette's body lying in the field. It was about 150 yards into the field. The clothing from Colette was found in the ditch, which was very nearby. They attended and quickly realised it was a crime scene and placed a small cordon at the edge of the field to prevent members of the public from entering into the field. So the scene was effectively secured very early on.
Colette's body was found just over 3 kilometres from her home. A forensic pathologist's post-mortem would conclude she'd been sexually assaulted and strangled. As part of the examination, semen from the killer is recovered and stored.
The community of Keyworth just went into shock. Every family's nightmare that a family member just disappears off the face of the earth.
So on the Monday morning when Colette's body had been found, as soon as possible the investigation would seek information from the public. So very early on there would be a local press release, and there was indeed a national press release. So the community in Keyworth would quickly know what had happened, and that understandably would cause concern to the local community, because they're in fear that this man is living amongst them and may well strike again. So yes, there was a fair amount of tension and trepidation at that time.
The house-to-house inquiries would provide a vital clue about the car heard speeding off shortly after the last known sighting of Colette.
So what we now know is that the vehicle, the red Ford Fiesta, was stolen at about 4:30, because the owner of the vehicle saw the vehicle being driven away. We know it entered Keyworth at about 4:45, so some 15 minutes later, the red Ford Fiesta was sighted in Keyworth. And then, not long after that, the vehicle was seen parked up on Mount Pleasant in Keyworth. The vehicle remained there for some time.
There were multiple sightings of him all round the village for a couple of hours. And he'd stopped and approached women, a 17-year-old girl and a schoolgirl, at least, spuriously asking for directions, clearly engaging with women in some way, looking for something. This seemed to fit a pattern that the police could chase up and follow. It seemed the best lead.
A nationwide hunt was now launched to find the mysterious man in the red Fiesta, a man who police believed to be Colette's killer. In October 1983, police had launched a manhunt after the body of a 16-year-old girl had been found in a field near the town of Keyworth, Nottinghamshire. Colette Aram had been abducted, sexually assaulted and strangled. So far, the best lead detectives hunting for her killer had was a mysterious man driving a distinctive red Ford Fiesta.
The vehicle was in the area of Keyworth for a number of hours whilst he was trying to find his victim.
The car would later be found abandoned, but there was vital forensic evidence at the scene that linked the red Fiesta to the murder.
So we think the car that was used to abduct Colette obviously was the red Fiesta that came down Thirlby Lane, turned off the road about 1.5 miles out of Keyworth, behind the hedgerow, and we know that Colette was found at about 150 yards into the field, and the police discovered tyre tracks leading into and away from the field, and the vehicle that we think left those tracks was the red Ford Fiesta that was found on Mount Pleasant during the investigation.
Blood was also found in the car and swabs taken, and soon detectives had more crucial information about the man in the red Fiesta. The description of him given by one of the girls he approached earlier on the night Colette vanished allowed police to create a photo fit of their prime suspect.
And when she saw the likeness of the photo fit, she was actually physically sick. She obviously had seen the man that had taken Colette. Well, she obviously thought that she could have been the victim, and sadly Colette was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she'd been extremely lucky to avoid being captured by this man, an hour or so earlier.
By now, the story had gone national.
I think that post-Yorkshire Ripper era, there was an awareness, a greater awareness in the country that there were individuals out there who were capable of roaming around the country, as it were, and all concentrating on a particular geographical area and carrying out horrendous attacks on women. And there was a deeper awareness of that, and in a sense, a bit of a fear of that. Within 48 hours, they'd got a really good lead. The landlady of the Generous Britain pub in nearby Costock had a customer in, a client in, on that night. He'd ordered a pint of orange juice and lemonade and a ploughman's cheese roll.
Two detectives went to see her and took a statement from her, and she recollected this man said he wasn't local, that he'd come off the motorway at the wrong junction, but she also noticed that he got blood on his hands. She thinks that the man saw her looking at his hands. He asked where the toilet was. He went to the toilet. So she recollected this account to the detectives that went, and they went to the gents' toilets, and lo and behold, there was a bin, and they recovered the tissues that apparently had got blood staining on the tissues.
The quick thinking of detectives had secured a vital piece of forensic evidence that could belong to the killer. There was only one issue. The science to extract vital genetic information from the tissue didn't exist. So investigators would have to rely on old-fashioned police work to try to identify their suspect through witness statements and house-to-house inquiries.
There was a process of trying to eliminate those and establish where those individuals were at the material time. So that was a key part of the investigation. And latterly, when the case was looked at, there were over 900 persons of interest in the system. So it was a massive undertaking.
By mid-November, detectives received some new information. But this isn't from a member of the public. Chillingly, it's direct from Colette's killer.
An anonymous letter was received purporting to have been written by the offender, saying, "It was Halloween, I was wearing a mask, you won't catch me, and I've left the area." And to prove that it was me, was she wearing a blouse? At the time, the fact that Colette's blouse had been tied around one of her wrists and was still on her body, that wasn't publicised by the investigation teams.
He's taunting them about their failure to find him. The police kind of have to release it and want to release it, but they're aware that it doesn't make them look in a good light at all. And then we get this uneasy relationship between the police and the media. And the message will be, well, no, they haven't solved it. Well, yes, they did get off to a great start, and it did look extremely promising just 2 weeks ago, but they haven't cracked it.
While it may have taunted the officers searching for the killer, it also offered them forensic evidence that could help catch him.
It was forensically examined, but there were finger marks found on the letter, and those finger marks were used to try and eliminate people from the inquiry. 900 people that had been put forward, so they were being traced and their movements looked at, their fingerprints checked against the letter, and enquiries done into the background of these individuals. So that was the thrust of the inquiry for some considerable time.
But the fingerprints left on the letter didn't lead to a suspect. Neither did a national TV appeal.
So the suspicion may have begun to be planted in people's mind that maybe this Colette case was a similar case to the Ripper, where someone was apparently above the law and capable of deceiving the police on multiple occasions, getting away with crime after crime after crime and taunting them about it, which almost encouraged their own behaviour to go out and do it again. Was this killer going to go out and do it again?
But rather than strike again, it seemed that Colette's killer would simply vanish into thin air. And by April 1984, the inquiry into Colette Aram's murder was quietly wound down.
Well, a case such as this, it's demoralising for not only the detectives working on the case, but the policing community right throughout Nottinghamshire and the local community. Whilst ever this person had not been caught, had they committed other offences.
New reports through the 1980s would highlight that Colette's murder wasn't an isolated incident in Britain at the time. In the 3 years that followed Colette's murder, schoolgirl Melanie Rode in Bristol and then Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth in Leicestershire were all victims of sexual killers. These were unrelated to Colette's case, but like hers, would remain unsolved for years as the murderers carried on their lives.
It was always in the psyche of the police and the local community, was this man still out there?
12 years after Colette's murder, DNA fingerprinting was now a vital tool in the forensic armoury of detectives.
In 1995, the law was changed so that people who had been arrested for a recordable offence could have DNA taken from them as a matter of course. And very quickly, the National DNA database grew so that in 1997, there were effectively millions of people on it.
It was also being used to examine evidence in cold cases. Dr. Tim Clayton, then based at the Forensic Science Service Lab in Wetherby, West Yorkshire, was part of the service's cold case team.
I was allocated the case in 1997, which came in just as a simple review. It was, this is an undetected murder and we'd like to do some more DNA tests. I was sent a microscope slide and that was made originally in 1983 from one of the intimate swabs that had been taken from Colette's body at the forensic post-mortem in 1983. And this is like a mini time capsule because secure and safe away from the environment under that glue is a little spot of cells from the original offence, and those cells contain DNA, and if we can get at that DNA, then we can raise a DNA profile, and if we can get a DNA profile, then we can challenge the National DNA Database.
14 years after Colette was brutally murdered as she walked to her boyfriend's house, could advances in forensic science finally reveal who the killer was? In Nottinghamshire, police investigating the vicious murder of teenager Colette Aram in 1983 were hoping advances in forensic science and DNA might finally trap her killer. 14 years after the murder, Dr. Tim Clayton from the Forensic Science Service was hoping a fragment of paper tissue recovered from the Generous Britain pub could reveal the killer's identity.
I subjected that to DNA tests, the ones that we'd got at the time in 1997, and I got what we call in the trade a partial profile. In other words, a full DNA profile back then would have consisted of 20 elements, and I found 3. Although we had obtained a little bit of genetic information about the offender, we were a long way away from having his full DNA profile.
Despite the advances in science, it seemed once again that Colette's killer would evade capture. "22 years after the murder in Keyworth, Kevin Flint, now a detective superintendent, is past the cold case file on Colette Aram.
You hear of people talk about old cases being closed. They're never closed. There's always someone responsible. There's always a senior investigating officer dedicated to an undetected case such as this. So these cases are never closed.
A public appeal on the 20th anniversary had produced 300 new leads. Armed with these and the evidence from the original inquiry, Kevin once again began to investigate the murder of Colette.
And one of the key things that, in tandem with looking at the 300 calls, we decided to look what we might be able to do forensically. We had blood samples from Colette's blouse, we had intimate samples that had been examined in '97 with a limited result, and we had the blouse and we had the blood-stained tissue. Well, we knew the blood-stained tissue had got semen on.
And while the first cold case review had provided investigators with only a partial DNA match, now a new test had been developed that would prove a game changer. It was called low-copy number testing.
So it was the same DNA profiling test that I'd used in 1997, but it had been made super sensitive. In other words, it could target smaller amounts of DNA. Not only we'd got material that we could go back at, but I'd also got better tools in my toolbox. So was I encouraged? Yes, I thought we had a shot at this.
Dr. Clayton's DNA deep dive started with a slide containing material taken from the seat of the red Ford Fiesta, driven by the killer.
And when I tested that was a blood stain that they were looking for. Initially made the slide to try and find semen, but there wasn't any. But when I tested that blood stain, I got a full DNA profile matching Colette. And so that was the first time we'd had proof positive that Colette had been inside the Ford Fiesta and bleeding. So that was the first real piece of success.
Establishing the car's connection to Colette was one thing. Now they needed to identify the killer. Once again, Dr. Clayton would return to the paper towel found in the Generous Britain pub.
When I looked at the results of those tests, several of them showed mixtures of DNA between Colette and an unknown male.
A single clean sample of the man's DNA was also collected, which matched semen swabs taken from Colette's body during the post-mortem examination.
And so the circle was completed. We'd now linked Colette to the car to the scene to the Generous Britain, and our man to the paper towel in the Generous Britain. And so the question was, who was this male?
It was a massive break for Kevin Flint's cold case team, who now hoped that a matching profile would exist on the National DNA Database. The database contains the record of any person convicted of an offence since 1995. from minor crimes to more serious offences.
It's just a natural reaction that you imagine, you suspect that the person who's committed such an horrific crime will have committed other offences, may well be on the national database for committing something.
That night I arranged for it to be loaded to the national DNA database, and then we sat there with bated breath waiting for the results to come back. Within a very short space of time the results were back, and our moment of euphoria was dashed completely because it came back as negative. In other words, there were no matching subject records on the national DNA database.
We're crestfallen. I assumed that someone who'd committed such an horrendous crime as this will be on the national DNA database, and lo and behold, they weren't.
It is one of the most frustrating things in forensic science to have the DNA profile of what you believe to be the offender. You've got an extremely sharp tool. You can eliminate practically everybody in the world, but somehow you've got to get to that person, to take a swab from them, to compare them.
The forensic breakthrough the cold case team had banked on hadn't happened, and the chances of identifying Colette's killer seemed to be ebbing away.
The question now falls, well, do we just leave the DNA profile sat on the database and hope that the offender will one day come on to the national database? Or do we actually now begin to start doing investigative work to try and identify new suspects and nominals? And in fact, that's what the team decided.
Police profiling suggested the offender might still live locally, so an operation began to swab as many men as possible in the Keyworth area.
And so one by one people were asked for voluntary swabs, and they gave them, and one by one they were eliminated. So day by day, hour by hour, month by month, we gradually got through and eliminated lots of people. There were occasionally people in there who looked potentially like they might be the offender, but the DNA test proved otherwise.
In total, more than 5,000 men were tested and eliminated from the inquiry. Despite the forensic profile, police still couldn't directly identify Colette's killer. The key to unlocking the murder of the schoolgirl 25 years ago would unbelievably come courtesy of a beloved elderly lady called Gladys Godfrey.
Gladys was well known in the community. She used to stand on her walker outside her front door and wave at the kids going to school and coming back from school. She was a really lovely person. The Ladybrook estate in Mansfield is a really close-knit community. There's lots of residential streets, and Gladys's bungalow, where she lived, there's a club opposite it where people would go and socialise and have drinks. And so there was lots of people in the area coming and going that knew Gladys, that would recognise Gladys, and she was one of their own, one of the people that was important in that community.
But in 2001, this close-knit community was shocked when Gladys was targeted by a burglar.
Someone entered her property, attacked her, but she managed to fight him off with a lemonade bottle, and she scratched him. She pulled his earring out. And that just shows what type of person that she was, that even though that she was so small, she was under 5 foot, she weighed just 6 stone.
Forensics recovered a DNA profile of the attacker, but a search of the national database failed to provide a match. And then a year later, Gladys was targeted again, and this time the feisty lady hadn't managed to fight off her attacker.
From what we know of that night, we know the attack was brutal. We know that Gladys was dragged from the living room into the bedroom, which is where she was found by police. And the police have said it's one of the most brutal killings that they've ever experienced.
The forensic evidence recovered from Gladys's murder would shock investigators.
But it was established by the scientists that the partial profile from the previous attack matched our current profile, so we knew the attacker had come back and sexually assaulted Gladys and killed Gladys. So we knew we got the same man. What we had was a description, a physical description of Gladys's murderer, because Gladys had made a statement about her attack and she described him as a white male in his early 20s with dark hair.
Police had a description and a DNA profile, but once again, a database search drew blanks. But Kevin and his team were prepared to use a new DNA profiling technique that was emerging. Familial DNA allows investigators to identify close relatives of a potential offender, which in turn could lead them to their suspect.
And the people that were of interest at the top of the list, either the parent-child or the sibling list, we would then draw up a family tree and visit the males of interest and eliminate them from the inquiry. And that's what we did on the Gladys inquiry.
They went into the community. The police were asking all men in the local area to give their DNA, and they took over 1,000 swabs. People were willing to come forward. They wanted for this killer to be caught because it meant something in their community. They were not going to let this person go free.
It took several months of swabbing and testing, but soon there were several positive hits based on the number of alleles, a gene variant that matched the original samples from the killer.
So we had a family with 15 alleles in Manchester, we had a family in Mansfield with 14 alleles, and then we had a family in Mansfield with 13 alleles, and that was the family of Ward. There was the mother, the father, and two sons who lived at the family address.
Further tests would finally pinpoint their suspect.
They tracked him down to a plastics factory that he worked at in the area, and that's where the police arrested Jason Ward, who was 22 at the time, and the community was shocked that such a young man could rape and murder an 87-year-old woman.
The familial DNA technique came online, and within 3 months of us utilising that tool, we'd got a man. This case was the first homicide, the first murder case where someone was convicted utilising familial DNA.
Gladys's case was a landmark moment. Could familial DNA now hold the key to another of Kevin's murder cases? "22 years since teenage hairdresser Colette Aram was murdered in the small Nottinghamshire town of Keyworth. Cold case detectives are hoping forensic science will finally bring her killer to justice. They hoped a familial DNA testing program, where a relative's profile would closely match that of their suspect, would help trace the man who savagely murdered the 16-year-old in 1983.
All that generated a list of 272 what we call nominals. In other words, these are people who could be related to the offender, but could not be the offender. So the question was, who are these people and who are their relatives? And bit by bit, we worked our way through that 272 nominal list and managed to exclude every single person on it. We double-checked, cross-checked, and at the end of the day, having made all those checks and done everything, we had failed to find a potential family member of the offender.
Almost 3 years since the cold case review began re-examining Colette's murder, once again, investigators looked to be at a dead end.
Science has advanced to the point which should lead them to the killer. And so They run it through this ever-growing national database, and guess what? It's another 2 steps forward and 1 step back. They've got the DNA, it doesn't match anything on the database. And that must have been a hammer blow.
To be honest with you, I was pretty well out of ideas at that point. But just as a last comment almost, I just said, well, it has taken us 18 months to do all the familial searching. I guess there's a small possibility that a relative of the offender could come on the database in the 18 months that we've been doing all this work. I think it's a bit of a long shot, but it's easy to do. Amongst those was a local man who'd actually been sampled in the June of that year, so luckily for us had only just gone onto the National DNA database.
Could this be the breakthrough the cold case team need to solve the case?
They arrest a young man on a minor motoring offence. He is DNA swabbed routinely. The new DNA sample was from a young man called John Paul Hutchinson, 20 years old, clearly not the killer. But they start to investigate his family, and they look at his father. The father is one of 4 brothers. There are other relatives, but police now intensively look at this family.
One of the brothers had recently died, but police would obtain forensic samples from the remaining 3 relatives to see if their DNA matched that of Colette's killer.
They were brought into custody, they were interviewed. 2 of the brothers spoke freely and gave their accounts of their recollection of the events and where they were in 1983, fully cooperated, gave their fingerprints, gave their DNA. Paul Hutchinson was interviewed and went no comment throughout a series of interviews, gave his DNA, gave his fingerprints.
Paul Hutchinson's demeanour during questioning aroused suspicions. But would the forensic tests confirm he was indeed the man detectives had been hunting for more than a quarter of a century?
And we did them in very short order, and the 2 uncles were positively eliminated. The one that was taken from, now we know to be Paul Hutchinson, was a full match to the Generous Britain paper towel.
The familial DNA link from his son who committed the motoring offence wasn't the only forensic evidence that connected Paul Hutchinson to the murder.
I received a telephone call from the fingerprint officers to say that they'd establish Paul Hutchinson's fingerprints on the anonymous letter. Ironically, above the words, "got me caught."
But the question remained, where had Paul Hutchinson been for so long, and how had he managed to evade capture?
In 25 years, in the intervening period between the killing and his eventual arrest, he'd become something close to a pillar of the community.
But when questioned about the brutal rape and murder, Hutchinson offered no real explanation for his actions.
When he was finally arrested, there were 2 sentences that he said to police ever, really, about this case were, "I'll tell you all I can, but I can't remember much. It's like a dream." And that almost, you know, has the ring of truth about it. It would seem a one-off episode in his life where he just completely became another person, lost control, came out of himself and committed this terrible, terrible crime.
For over 2 decades, the man now suspected of killing Colette had been living in plain sight, even being questioned by police as part of the original house-to-house inquiries.
And what they find is that Paul Hutchinson was living 7 streets away from Colette at the time of the murder. He was absolutely on the spot. Interestingly, he shaved his head around the murder, changed his appearance, disappeared, said he was going for lung cancer treatment.
But we established that he'd never had cancer, he'd not had a lung removed, and it was a ruse that he portrayed to his family and to the police to effectively get away with this. The man was an inveterate liar.
But this wouldn't be the final deception Paul Hutchinson would attempt. Something Dr. Tim Clayton had worried about since the arrest.
First thing that sprung into my mind was, I wonder if he's going to blame his dead brother.
He said that they'd gone out to commit a burglary that evening when they'd used the car, and that he'd decided that Paul had decided he couldn't commit the offence, and he'd left his brother with the car, and his brother must have committed the offence.
Thankfully, forensics were able to disprove Hutchinson's last-ditch defence.
And I was able to test that sample, and I got a DNA profile, and I was able to conclusively prove that whilst it was part of the same family, this individual, albeit he was deceased, could not have been the offender. So at that point, we had ruled out all three brothers.
But what we obviously knew was that it was Paul's fingerprints on the anonymous letter. That didn't prove the murder, but his full profile on the tissue obviously clearly was significant evidence. But we'd established a profile of his dead brother, and that didn't match the profile.
Thanks to the advances in forensic science, detectives could finally get justice for Colette.
This is at Nottingham Crown Court. Mr. Justice Flo, passing sentence. It was a truly horrendous attack, violent, twisted and perverted. It was a terrible act which has torn Colette's family apart and left a community haunted. The killing was clearly premeditated. You concealed your guilt for 25 years and only pleaded guilty when the evidence became overwhelming. The terror and degradation that this poor girl must have suffered at the hands of a stranger in her last moments are unimaginable. You have lived your life with your wife and children who were completely ignorant of who you were. And then, as Hutchinson just looked vacantly at the family, the judge told him he was recommending him for a tariff of 25 years. Take him down.
Superintendent Kevin Flint, who worked on the original investigation nearly 3 decades earlier, was now able to close the case that had dogged him almost all his career.
It's just fantastic. It's what you've strived for the family, for the policing community, the people that had tried to solve this case over many years, for the scientists, now that science had advanced so well. They worked tirelessly. You know, hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands of people over the years had worked on a case such as this.
There's a little adage in forensic science about you need a lucky break. We were unlucky that the person we were seeking wasn't on the National DNA Database, but then lucky that between the first and the second familial searches, a relative of that person was added to the database. And I think that was the key. Without that piece of, that stroke of luck, that the timings were just right, and at that point we knew we'd caught the killer.
Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
Each bit of information delivers that to the whole jigsaw.
I was able to test that sample and I got a DNA profile.
There's no doubt at all that forensics were absolutely crucial in this case.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science were able to bring some of our most dangerous and despicable killers to justice.
This was such an unnatural crime.
It's not a question of if he will kill again, it's a question of when.
He believed that he was invincible and that nothing could stop him.
We'll hear how some of the toughest and most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
When you begin a forensic investigation, you don't know what you're going to find.
The officer plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
From the type of insects that were around, she'd been dead for at least 5 years.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man.
In this episode, the savage murders of 3 teenage girls leaves communities in South Wales terrified.
This wasn't a person, this wasn't a human being, this was some fiend, some monster.
The case goes cold for almost 30 years, until a forensic breakthrough.
It was groundbreaking. This was the very first time in the world that this had been done.
Science might have identified a serial killer. Now, will evidence from beyond the grave prove they found the murderer?
Witnesses who were present at the exhumation say that when the first shovel went in the ground, there was a huge clap of thunder, and they were unearthing evil.
This is forensics, catching the killer.
I was a young detective, or a temporary detective at the time, just got onto CID, working in a police station probably about 20 miles north of here. But on the day that the bodies were found, this would have been full of police officers. This would have been obviously the main area to start the investigation.
In 1973, Wyn Phillips was one of many officers being drafted into the Port Talbot area from across South Wales to assist with a murder case unlike any other seen locally until that time.
So uniformed police officers would form lines. They would be scouring the area, examining the area for any clues, any weapons, anything that may be of evidential value, and anything that could add value to the investigation.
The bodies of 2 teenage girls had been found in woods near a main road. Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd were just 16 years old. Both were normal teenagers living with their families in Neath and Llandarcy, and both had been subjected to a terrible and brutal attack.
Both girls were found having been raped and with rope tied around their neck.
Journalist Martin Shipton, who's worked the South Wales patch for nearly 30 years, remembers the story.
Pauline's body was found with her face down, and she had been strangled with a 5-foot rope, and she'd also been battered, so the clothing was heavily blood-stained. Geraldine's body was found a few yards away, which has led to speculation that the killer had to run after her to catch her. You know, perhaps she was trying to escape, but obviously he was able to outrun her and overpower her. There was also evidence that because there was mud on their feet, that the killer had allowed them to dress again afterwards, So they were able to put their stockings on, and one can only speculate about exactly what the circumstances were.
There may very well have been screams, but if you look around, who would have heard them? The chances of them being seen in that area at that time of night were very remote. He probably knew that, and that's why he brought them here. This had never been seen before, double murder of two 16-year-old girls in this area. The community outraged. It was a terrible, terrible day, wasn't it, to find two bodies, two young girls who'd been out the night before and had never got home.
It was a crime that shook tight-knit communities across the whole of South Wales.
The nearest town to Pauline and Geraldine was Port Talbot, where there was a huge steelworks. In 1973, the steelworks alone was employing about 13,000 people. It was a very working-class town. Lots of people had come to work there from other places in Wales and even further afield. So a lot of people were around, but it was a very friendly sort of place, and it was a sort of place where people would leave their doors open, and neighbours would be in and out of each other's houses, typical working-class community.
Sharon Morgan was only 14 years old at the time of the murders. She knew both girls well.
We lived in this world that was good. It was a good world until that night. And that morning, the world was no longer a good world. Geraldine and Pauline were friends of mine. Geraldine was my cousin. She'd become my cousin in March 1973, because my mother's sister had married Geraldine's brother. So we weren't just friends then, we were also cousins. But Geraldine and Pauline and me were in the same school together. So we made friends through the school, but they were a little bit older than me. Geraldine had a music set, like a player, in her back room in the parlour, and she used to learn the words to the songs, and she would sing them with a brush in her hand, and we all enjoyed. It was just fun, and she was a lovely girl. She was full of life. Pauline was a beautiful girl. She was lovely, and she loved clothes and fashion and makeup, and she was lovely too. So the night that they went to the top rank, I was on my way down to the Neath Fair on the bus, and I saw them on the opposite side to the bus stop. Waved to them because I was on the bus going to the fair. And then I never saw them again.
Geraldine and Pauline's regular Saturday night out together would be their last. The concern for both police and the terrified towns and villages of the South Wales Valleys was that this maniac was one of their own.
I mean, was that killer living amongst the community? Was the killer known to the two girls? Could it have been somebody who was working in the area at the time the M4 was being built? The steelworks employed loads of people. There were, there were men travelling back and forth.
Everyone was afraid, because this man wasn't just someone who had killed someone in a rage or, a family argument. This man had killed two girls, 16-year-old girls. What else was he capable of doing? What kind of monster was this person? So the fear was horrendous. This wasn't a person, this wasn't a human being, this was some fiend, some monster who you couldn't even put a face to him. He was just so evil, and evil was there, and It was in the community.
In 1973, South Wales was rocked by a sickening double murder. The bodies of teenagers Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd had been found strangled to death in woods near a main road. Both had been raped. The friends had last been seen on a night out in Swansea. Their usual routine would have been to catch the bus into town and then hitchhike the short 7-mile drive home to the village of Llandarcy.
For two 16-year-old girls in the early 70s, the attitude to life was very carefree. So if they wanted to go to the big city of Swansea, they would just factor in, if you like, the fact that they would have to hitchhike back, and they wouldn't think about it. They wouldn't think about the potential danger. It was something that a lot of young girls did, and they wouldn't even consider that it was a matter of risk. You know, they would just do it.
In 1973, investigating a double murder and rape in a normally sleepy part of South Wales was not something local police had much experience of. But one thing they did know, the killer was still at large.
It could have been somebody from outside. It was the uncertainty and the fact that could this person strike again? That's always in the back of people's minds. And, you know, I think that women, and especially young people, probably were more concerned about their safety after this incident happened, because they realised by thumbing a lift home, it could end your life.
One of the problems was that there were a potentially huge number of suspects as a result of various factors. The steelworks alone employed 13,000 men, so technically they could all be suspects in the case. There was a lot of construction going on at the time, so there were lots of itinerant workers who didn't necessarily come from the local area who were working there, and tracking those people down was a huge task. And then also it just so happened that the time of the murder coincided with the Neath Fair, which is something that attracts people from quite a long way.
With no CCTV in 1973, investigators relied on eyewitnesses to piece together Pauline and Geraldine's last known movements. Luckily, someone came forward.
The last sighting of the two girls alive was near the top rank in Swansea, where they were seen getting into an Austin 1100, which was white, which was driven by somebody who wasn't entirely visible to the witness who saw him and saw the girls getting into the car.
Who was the mystery driver who picked the girls up outside the top-ranked nightclub that night? Was he the killer?
Later on, a car of the same description was seen in the vicinity of the area where they were found in a lay-by. So that meant that there was an extremely strong possibility that the killer was the driver of this Austin 1100. That gave the police a bit of a break, but of course the Austin 1100 was a very popular car at the time. They were having to trawl through all of these owners of Austin 1100s in the vicinity, but also further afield as well, which was hugely challenging in terms of the manpower that they had to use in order to carry out these various investigations and these interviews with the car owners.
So we were keen to establish who in the area owned a white 1100, and there was a set questionnaire that we took with us to visit owners of white 1100s and ask them the questions. Obviously, did they own the vehicle? Where was the vehicle? Where were they during the relevant time?
As well as trying to track down the car to find out who was driving it, police also knew it could contain important forensic evidence, such as bloodstains that could suggest signs of foul play.
What could have been done in 1973? Well, I think I'd start by saying that even by today's standards, the standard of examination was exemplary. But of course, we didn't have DNA.
The examinations of the cars failed to find blood, so they began looking for other forensic clues that could link the vehicle to the crime. Fibres from Geraldine and Pauline's clothes.
They looked at all of the vehicles, all of the white 1100 vehicles that were around the area at the time, and fibre tapings were taken of the seats to actually try to put the victims into the vehicle. So very straightforwardly, we'd probably use some adhesive tape to dab it onto the seats, pick off the tape, and look at it under a microscope. A little bit in the same way as you would do if you were removing lint from a jumper. Regrettably, they missed out on the most important vehicle.
But despite inquiries to thousands of people and travelling hundreds of miles around the UK to find the elusive Austin 1100 car, no fibres were found and no further clues came to light. It was as if the killer had simply vanished.
They just really reached a dead end. I mean, there was just nowhere else for them to go. They didn't have any forensic evidence that they would be able to use to check against individuals that they were interviewing. And the only eyewitness who saw anything at all was the person who saw the girls getting into an Austin 1100, but there wasn't a sufficiently good description of the individual who was driving the car for them to be able to track that person down. There was no number plate or anything like that.
But at the time, it was basically a paper-based system that, in some respects, caused more problem because you generated all this information, all these different people who could be deemed as persons of interest, but there was no way of actually putting everything together, checking every piece of information, the intelligence that was coming in, because obviously the police rely on intelligence as well in cases like this. There was no DNA in those days. Forensic science wasn't the way it is now. So they would have made a decision that perhaps they should run it down. Fortunately, the papers, the incident room statements, cards, all the information that came in was retained at Sandfields Police Station, and the clothing of the girls was retained along with other crime scene items.
The samples were taken from both Geraldine and Pauline. They were stored meticulously, I have to say, all those years ago.
Unbeknown to police at the time, there was more forensic evidence that could help solve this double murder. It had been collected from the body of another young girl, just 15 years old, which had been found not far from Geraldine and Pauline's bodies, in a remote hillside spot only 2 months earlier. She too had never made it home after a Saturday night out, and she too had been raped and strangled. Could the same person have killed all three girls? By late 1973, a double murder investigation of 2 teenage girls had gone cold. Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd were savagely raped and murdered on their way home from a night out in nearby Swansea. But just 2 months earlier, in July of that year, another girl never made it home from her night out either. Her body was found 3 days later in a remote spot in the hills near Port Talbot. She too had been raped and strangled to death.
So what we know about Sandra Newton is that she was 15 years of age. She was from Neath. She'd been out in a nightclub in Britton Ferry, which is a few miles away, and after being in the nightclub, she met her boyfriend. And then after meeting him, she was hitchhiking home, and that was when she was abducted by the murderer. Sandra Newton had been raped. She had been choked to death with her own skirt and left in a culvert which was close to a disused colliery called Tonmawr. And the police at the time came to the conclusion that the murderer was somebody local because the area where she was dumped was pretty remote, and it's not the sort of place that someone who was a random visitor from outside would have known about.
A very unusual case for that area of Neath. You know, in that time there wasn't that many murders in that area, especially a sexually motivated strangulation of a young girl. But at that time, I have to say, there was no link made between Sandra and the two girls who were found in September, Geraldine and Pauline.
One thing that linked the investigations into the murders of Geraldine and Pauline with that of Sandra was that bodily samples and clothing were taken from all the victims and perfectly stored for years to come.
There would have been blood samples, fingernail scrapings, that type of examination. And of course the clothing from the victims.
With no new developments or realisation at the time that these murders could be linked, the investigations were wound down until 1999, when South Wales Police started to review some of its unsolved serious crimes. By then, there had been some major advances in forensic science, and in particular, the use of DNA.
In the late 90s, in the case of Geraldine and Pauline, and indeed Sandra, they were able to locate the underwear of the girls and all the clothing, for that matter, that was retained. And they were able to look at the semen stains and obviously the body fluids on the clothing. We had developed a strategy to look at old cases in the light of new technology to see what we could do to investigate undetected murder investigations from the years gone by.
Wynne and his team now called in the help of Home Office forensic scientists.
The advances in science had become such that we were able to generate DNA from these the samples that we'd got from the time, the samples from the victims, the clothing from victims, and of course they matched together. So at that stage we didn't know who the potential perpetrator might be, but what we did know was the cases matched. That was discovered because the DNA from what had ever been collected from the scene, from the victims themselves and from the victims' clothing, DNA matched the one male individual. So at that time we knew that it was the same person who killed Sandra, Pauline and Geraldine.
In 2001, after more than a quarter of a century, forensic science had been able to connect the crimes to the same brutal killer.
So that was quite a breakthrough. It was, you know, you realised then that, this is a serial killer. He hadn't killed just one, he'd killed three, and on two separate occasions, just months apart, which again was probably the first for South Wales Police to deal with what we found ourselves with a serial killer.
And yet, the murders of this first serial killer, the ones known of at least, had taken place nearly 30 years earlier. But by now, the national database had been set up, listing all the DNA profiles of anyone who had been in police custody since 1995.
So we called a meeting of pathologists, we called a meeting of forensic scientists, all the experts, and the pathologist from 1973 who had conducted the postmortems on the 3 girls, any scientists who were still left from 1973. So we all met in police headquarters in Bridgend and talked it through, went over the July incident, the September double murder.
But the euphoria of having thought they would finally find the killer was quickly followed by yet another setback. The DNA profile of the killer, now dubbed the Saturday Night Strangler by the press, was uploaded to the national database. Would police now get a name?
The DNA profile had been produced, sent off to the database. There were no matches.
The killer's DNA wasn't on the database. But thankfully, another pioneering DNA technique meant all was not lost.
Of course, science and understanding had advanced. We'd been experimenting with the concept of familial DNA, which looks to exploit the similarities between brothers and sisters, parents and their children. So you can actually look for people who are not on the database through their children or their siblings who actually are on the database. They share a similar DNA profile.
While the forensic scientists were searching to find anyone on the national database who had similar DNA to that found on the clothing of the victims, Wynne and his team used good old-fashioned police work to look again at the people of interest from the original case files.
So they went through a long list of suspects who had come into that category, or persons of interest, whether they were owners of 1100s, whether they were associates of the girls, or whether other information came in, sightings, descriptions, everything like that. So what we needed now is to look at any suspects how do we match a suspect against the profile that we've got? And the best way to do that would be to take a blood sample. We're talking about 1973. Not everybody was still alive. Not everybody was still in the area. The team managed to reduce the list of suspects or persons of interest to us down to about 500 or so, and even down way below that as well. And, you know, they would have started going to these people and taking blood samples, and they would have been matched against the profile that we've got.
For the forensic scientists, one family's name on that list stood out. That name was Cappan.
We've got somebody here whose DNA profile is very similar to the man who was of interest to this investigation back in 1973. It was about 50% similar, which is quite a bit. Family member, it couldn't have been him because he would only have been a young boy at the time.
If this man was too young to have committed the murders in the 1970s, could any of his relatives be the killer?
And he actually was the son of this bouncer from Port Talbot called Joseph Cappan. Joe Cappan was a petty criminal. There had been some knowledge of him from police officers who said that he was someone who could be prone to having temper outbreaks and that he could be prone to violence.
Someone who has experienced that violence firsthand is Teresa Fisher. She'd been in a relationship with Joe Cappan in 1983, 10 years after the murders of Geraldine, Pauline and Sandra, and when Teresa herself was only 16 years old, the same age as that of the victims.
This is where I grew up with my gran and grandfather. There's my gran and grandfather's house, where I stayed when I was 16. And I was coming home from the Alex, and I came down here, and then I came up this path, but I could hear Teresa, and he was sitting in his car, and I went to the car. And because my grandfather and my gran in bed, I said, oh, Joe, come over by here, because I didn't want to disturb them. So I walked over here with Joe, and because I was a bit of a fiery girl, and he had upset me, I slapped him as I was standing in this position. So I slapped him. I didn't really know there was a telegraph pole behind me, but out of nowhere, he grabbed me by the neck and held me against the telegraph pole. As soon as he left his hand against my throat, straight away he said, come for a ride, Therese. And a ride I went with him. And that ride at 3 o'clock in the morning was Llandarcy. So to me, I'm just going on exciting rides. I'm 16, never met anyone with a car before. And there I am now going for these rides, which happened often.
But why did Joseph Cappan take the young Teresa that night to the very woods in Llandarcy, where 10 years previously the bodies of Geraldine and Pauline had been found? In January 2000, police had officially reopened the investigations into the double murder of two 16-year-old girls, Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd, as well as the killing of 15-year-old Sandra Newton. All had been raped and strangled, and all by the same man. They now had a DNA profile of the murderer, and through the revolutionary process of familial DNA tracing, one name in particular had surfaced: Joseph Cappan. And frustratingly for South Wales Police, he was a man who lived locally to the murders in 1973 and who owned a particular type of car.
Joseph Cappan actually became a person of interest to the investigation, the original investigation. He owned a 1100 car. Police went to his house, and they probably had the same form as I did to complete. When they went to the house, his vehicle was up on ramps, and they noticed he had an 1100 car. They completed the form. I believe he gave them a false alibi, and he said that his vehicle was not roadworthy.
Now, nearly 30 years later, in 2001, the investigation had come full circle and straight back to Joseph Cappan's doorstep. Had forensics finally led police to the killer of Geraldine, Pauline and Sandra?
When Joseph Cappan became the #1 suspect, the police obviously wanted to trace him, so they went to his house, knocked on the door, and his wife came to the door, and they spoke to her, and she told them that, in fact, Cappan had died 13 years before. He died in 1990 from lung cancer.
Another setback. Police now had to get DNA samples from Cappan's wife and some of his other children in order to see if they could match parts of their DNA to that found on the victim's clothing. But those results proved inconclusive too.
That meant that the only option that remained to them in order to conclusively demonstrate that Joseph Cappan was the killer was to exhume his body. And indeed, they then made an application to the Home Secretary, who was David Blunkett at the time, that they should be allowed to do that. Permission was granted.
Everything was planned. There was operational orders. People were fully aware of how we were going to do it. The tents were erected in Goitre Cemetery to obviously make sure of privacy. Everybody knew what their role was, from the grave diggers to the forensic scientists to the pathologists to the senior investigating officers. From the moment that we started, it was incredible, really. There was a clap of thunder, lightning, and a storm. And, you know, it was incredible. I mean, we all looked around and thought, God, where did that come from?
Witnesses who were present at the exhumation say that when the first shovel went in the ground, there was a huge clap of thunder, and those who were present came to the conclusion that they were unearthing evil.
And he was taken then to Morriston Hospital mortuary. I went along to the post-mortem. We took his femur, jawbone and teeth, because that's where we were told that that's where they would obtain the DNA. Within days, we had a result back which was absolutely positive, you know, beyond reasonable doubt. Couldn't have been anybody else.
Finally, after an investigation spanning nearly 30 years, Wynne and his team had solved the mystery of who had raped and killed the three teenagers, Sandra, Geraldine and Pauline, all those years ago, thanks to the game-changing use of familial DNA tracing. A first, not just for South Wales Police, but for worldwide forensic investigators.
It was groundbreaking. This was the very first time in the world that this had been done. And so people were, of course, very proud, both very proud within the police service and, of course, within the scientific community. Proud of what had happened, proud of the science, and I suppose relieved that once and for all, you know, that the victims had actually received some form of closure, and that they knew, albeit the perpetrator was dead, at least the case was closed, and they knew who'd committed these offences.
As the news broke, it shocked the local community. None more so than Teresa Fisher, who had dated Joseph Cappan nearly 20 years earlier, when she was just 16 years old herself. Especially terrifying was the realization that Cappan had taken Teresa to the very places where the victims' bodies had been found.
Joe Cappan drove me to this lane, and this is round about the place where we pulled up, and he left the car. He left the car, and I don't know where he went. He went ahead, and then he came back to the car then with a rock, placed it in my hands, and I put it in the front of the car. He said it was for him to take home for his rockery in the garden. Even though I came here in the day, it still gives me shivers, because this is something that he planned, and I didn't know. I just thought it was just right. But now I can see now, it was him. He was getting thrills out of this without me knowing. And then to think that this is a place where poor Sandra Newton, there's no words. I can't say any words. I can't describe what happened, because I just haven't got no words how to describe it. It just gives me shivers. And you're still getting a thrill out of coming back here. We're at the culvert now, where Sandra, poor Sandra, was found. Gives me shivers. And I can't stop thinking about poor Sandra, of what she went through. And realising that man coming back here, You still getting thrills, but it just gives me shivers now. But when I first came here, I just thought it was a ride. Didn't realise it meant all this. It was just a ride to me. This is the first time I've come back since the police brought me here. In 1983, I found out it must have been probably 10 years close to how everyone lost Sandra. And then finding out then that was 10 years later that he's bringing me here to when he murdered Sandra Newton, another 16-year-old. And to think I'm 16 and he's bringing me here to relive his sick memories.
Memories and questions were all the victims' families had. For nearly 30 years, they'd had no resolution or answers as to why that's all they'd been left with.
They were cherished, loved, you know, they weren't out on the streets, neglected children. They were lovely girls and they were happy and they had their whole lives ahead of them. They'd be in their 60s now, probably grandparents. If he had never encountered them, if only that man had never been born.
Finding out who the killer was gave one answer, but still left many other questions.
There was no trial, so I didn't understand how he did it. How could he have killed two girls at the same time? Why couldn't one have got away? But apparently Jane nearly did get away, and she almost got to the very road, which was 2 minutes to where her father was working that night. So she was almost out of the woods.
No trial, but a kind of justice for the families of Sandra, Pauline and Geraldine. But finding out who killed them left further unanswered questions for investigators. Did Joseph Cappan take even more secrets back to his grave with him?
People who have a liking for violent sexual crime are almost addicted to it. They only stop when they're stopped by law enforcement and the criminal justice process. Do I think that other investigations should take place? In short, yes. I think these will not be the only cases, the crimes that he committed. I'm pretty sure that there will be others out there.
Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
Each bit of information delivers that to the whole jigsaw.
I was able to test that sample and I got a DNA profile.
There's no doubt at all that forensics were absolutely crucial in this case.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science were able to bring some of our most dangerous and despicable killers to justice.
This was such an unnatural crime.
It's not a question of if he will kill again, it's a question of when.
He believed that he was invincible and that nothing could stop him.
We'll hear how some of the toughest and most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
When you begin a forensic investigation, you don't know what you're going to find.
The officer plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
From the type of insects that were around, she'd been dead for at least 5 years.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man.
In this episode, a simple missing person inquiry leads to an unexpected find in a freezer.
Having lifted up the lid, the first thing he sees is a human foot.
An agonising wait for families hoping it wasn't their loved one.
It was the waiting game that was horrible. It was like waiting to hear, is it her, isn't it her?
Before the most shocking discovery of all, not just one body in the freezer, but two.
One body is a dangerous person is at loose, but two, you're now talking about somebody who's on their way to essentially being a serial killer.
This is forensics, catching the killer. Every day, nearly 100 people are reported missing in London. In April 2019, police in Canning Town received a call about one more.
When somebody is reported missing in London, the officers will take a report, and it's that first stage where an assessment is made as to what kind of category that missing person sits within. Perhaps they could be somebody where it's a high risk, and the high risk can be things, people who potentially want to commit suicide, or perhaps are under threat from somebody else, or it's completely and utterly out of character and there is something really wrong.
Detective Chief Inspector Simon Harding was working for the Met at the time as one of their top senior investigating officers in serious crime.
A woman called the police on the 26th of April 2019 to 50 Vendome Close to check on the welfare of a man. She told the police that he was somebody who was ill, that she had been helping, and by that very nature that he was vulnerable and potentially could be ill. And this was his address that he told her. And the reason she'd done that is because she had been giving him money. She was an upstanding Christian woman in the society, and she almost looked to him as kind of as a project for her to help. And having taken almost £1,400 off her, towards the end, as it was when she called the police, she was worried about his health because he kept refusing to meet her. She called the police to say, he's supposed to meet me, he said he's very ill, can you check on his welfare? And that's the first time the police officers arrived at Vendome Close.
This address was situated in an area within the East End borough of Newham.
So Canning Town is quite a typical borough in London, full of diverse groups, lots of different religions all mixing together. It's probably one of the busier boroughs in London in terms of crime, but equally has quite a larger police presence than some of the smaller boroughs in London. It's quite close to some of the biggest financial centres in the world, and equally has its fair share of London estates and slightly more a poor area, if you like. Very diverse in terms of financial stability, should we say.
This seemed like any other missing person inquiry, with the usual sad but unremarkable possible outcomes.
So the police response to the woman's call was to attend the address, and much like a lot of calls in London where somebody is thought to have either collapsed behind locked doors or perhaps passed away, first they looked, banged on the door, no response, checked with neighbours, and having looked through the windows and made as best assessment as they could, and it was at that stage they said, well, let's leave it for 24 hours, whatever, just to see. He wasn't in the high-risk category at that stage.
The man's name was Zahid Yunus.
So when there's no contact after that time, then the officers would go back. And they were sent back, different officers this time, sent back to go and look at the premises. And this time they felt perhaps that they needed to just double check on his welfare. And the easiest way to get in at that time was through a window at the front.
Hello, police. Police officer, make yourself known.
The flat is in a fairly messy state. It's had a sort of wooden floor down, and there is no one there from what they can see. They go to search every room, and there is that sudden moment where one of the officers sees a room. It's a little bit like a box room, and the officers moved a lot of stuff away from their door.
There's a freezer here that I want to get into. It's locked.
The officer decided that he wanted to break the freezer open. He got a crowbar from the police van and broke open the freezer. And what we saw next was just incredible. Having lifted up the lid, there is a white sheet and something sticking up. When he moves the sheet, the first thing he sees is a human foot with a sock on, and the sock has got a Superman logo on. So the officer quickly did what he is trained to do, knew it was a crime scene, called his supervisor, and the place was shut and locked up, waiting for specialist units. I remember exactly where I was, sitting in the office when that phone call came in and said that there's a body been found in a freezer, which is incredibly suspicious. So the murder teams are called straight away to come and assess what might have happened. So one of the things we do is call a crime scene manager.
Initially, the sole focus would have been on this freezer.
Dave Collins has been a crime scene manager working with the Met for over 30 years.
He'd have done his crime scene assessment to look around just to see what else, to give you an idea of what is there. Are there any blood-stained weapons? We'd like to know how the victim has died at this point. So are there any blood-stained weapons, blood? To give you an idea of what may have occurred.
The crime scene manager would go there, make a forensic assessment without anybody else going in, just themselves, perhaps one other with them, and would report back, this is what we have initially, and talked about the flat being messy. There are items lying around. And in fact, was seen that there were items of female property within the flat at that time. So we already started to understand that there was something slightly out of the ordinary. If this guy lived here on his own, there are female handbags lying around. So that was fed back to me quite early on. It's important for me to get down to that scene to understand what it is about. So when I arrive here, there is cordon tape, there are police officers, uniformed officers guarding the scene and making sure that nobody enters who shouldn't be there. We sign everybody in and out to make sure that we have that continuity. And as people start to arrive, other specialisms, the crime scene manager would be here already, have started their forensic examination, and I would then get briefed by them. They would sit with me and we'd go through, perhaps with my detective sergeant, detective inspector, we'd go through everything that they could tell us about that particular scene. And also, I would be getting information all the time from other officers who are working on the investigation about people they might have spoken to, already knocking on neighbours' doors, people that might know them. And in this particular case, what was really important was, can you put Zahid Yunus with a female? And all those inquiries and research you do around potential people that live there start immediately. Because obviously you have body, but you have no person who might have done it. All those bits of the jigsaw around him and his involvement and link to the flat and everybody else's link to the flat need to be brought together at the same time that your priority is to start identifying who that person is in the freezer.
In the spring of 2019, police in East London searching the flat of a missing man made an altogether more shocking discovery. Locked inside a chest freezer, officers had found a frozen body. But just who was this person, and how had they ended up here?
In 2019, there was quite an increase in murders across London. It was reaching levels where we hadn't seen for quite a long time. So East London, in that quarter of London, was particularly busy, probably the busiest quarter of London at the time. So it wasn't uncommon for there to be a murder in this area.
As Simon and his team began to look for clues in the flat, the forensic investigators had one immediate priority.
That first major thing was to get the freezer out of that flat securely, because there was no electricity. The guy had not topped up his meter, so getting that out was important, because the body is now starting to defrost, or would start to defrost. And so getting it into a forensically secure area where, as it defrosted, we could deal with it in terms of a forensic examination was really important.
But what seemed like an already gruesome case was about to take a whole new turn.
The freezer's taken to the mortuary, and because of the fact that the body was frozen to the sides of the freezer as well, it was not something you could just take out. So it went under a CT scan or an X-ray, and it was then that I had the call to say, there's a second body underneath. You know, you never forget something like that. There's now 2 bodies in that freezer. So it was at that point we realised we really had somebody that was potentially incredibly dangerous. Yes, 1 body's a dangerous person is at loose, but 2, you're now talking about somebody who's on their way to essentially being a serial killer.
Now Simon and his team were in a race against time to find out who that killer was and to identify the victims.
It actually took quite a number of days before any post-mortem could take place, because it wasn't just that the body at the top was frozen to the sides of the freezer, it was also that the 2 bodies themselves and what they were wrapped in were frozen together as well. And the length of time that they'd been frozen meant that the thawing process of those 2 bodies, as horrible as it sounds, took such a long time to happen, days and days before we could even start a post-mortem. So, and that means that we can't necessarily quickly identify who the people are, because you can't get to the bodies because they were wrapped in different things. The body on top of the freezer was wrapped in a white sheet. That itself had frozen solid, and frozen solid around the body. And you could see that there was clothing on the body, in the legs, but you couldn't make any sort of form of facial identification at all at that time. You had to wait for everything to thaw out.
The body that lay on the bottom of the freezer, it was in a fetal position, in a blue sleeping bag, wrapped in plastic. The plastic came from the box that contained the freezer. With the bodies being defrosted and then frozen again, it resulted in both of them being heavily decomposed. Once they were separated, it was very difficult to assess their injuries for this reason and give a cause of death.
So the process was incredibly complex at the time, and people wanted answers as quickly as possible. You know, who were these people? And we have people come forward thinking it might be their daughters or sisters or mums who had been missing for a certain amount of time, and you couldn't give satisfactory answers straight away. So we had to wait to get to that stage where something on those bodies or something in the flat perhaps could give us that identification. So whilst I'm waiting for the bodies to defrost and the items to defrost, my teams are searching the flat in a forensically controlled way as well, under the guidance of the crime scene manager. and the methodical search that goes on there. Any items that we find as we search a flat can help to identify who those bodies might be. And there were some finds within the flat that started to bring some names forward, and was a handbag belonging to Mirajan Mustafa.
Mirajan Mustafa, also known to friends and family as Jan, had gone missing some 11 months earlier from her home in the nearby area of Custom House. In May 2018, with no knowledge of where she was, Mirajan's family had started an appeal to find her.
We'd go to local hospitals, we'd go to agencies, we'd go to markets, wherever we thought possible, we would go, print up our own posters and cover that area, just to make sure there was as much awareness as we could. We had a lot of support by the local Newham contact, helping us with newspaper articles, putting Jan's front page. Jan's personality is very bubbly, she's very lively. You know when Jan's in the room. She's got a really big, beautiful smile, and she just lights up the room. She was just really fun and lively, very bubbly person. She always put everyone before herself. She was always like that. She was a very loving and caring person. She loved street dancing. She would hire out halls and teach kids street dancing. She'd do it locally where she used to live all the time. Everyone knew Jan, everywhere. Everywhere you go, everyone knew Jan. Yeah, she was a very popular person.
I've always been close with my sister. Always been close with her. There's nothing she could ever do that'll upset me, you know, because she was, how can I say, she was so loving and caring. She'd always want to make everyone else happy and forget about herself.
Now, at long last, clues as to Mirajan's whereabouts began to surface.
In that handbag was things like medication with her name on the label, other personal items. She had been reported missing by her family, her sister, her cousin, and there was an active missing persons inquiry. But that missing persons inquiry had been going on since May 2018. As we search the flat and we find any names, female especially, we want to get to them as quickly as possible, find out where they are to ensure they're still alive. If there are lots of female items in a flat, which there were in this case with different names, then it's important for us to get to them as quickly as possible. And we did. But the one that stood out was Jan, because she was a missing person and she was still missing to that very day. So that was really at the time I thought, well, it's looking likely that this is Mirajan Mustafa, who is in the freezer.
I was on the train coming back from work, and I was just waiting for the bus. And again, I'm on my phone, going through my messages, and I come up across an article online that said that something had happened in Custom House, where some bodies had been found in a property. Well, as soon as they told us, me and Mel just literally broke down crying in the house, and we was hugging police, like, we don't even know you, but it just felt like the right, you know, you freeze, you don't know what to do, like, it was just, yeah, it was really hard, and like, it was the waiting game that was horrible. It was like waiting to hear, is it her, isn't it her?
So if one of the dead women in the freezer was Mirajan, who was the second? In 2019, the bodies of 2 women had been found in a freezer in a flat in Canning Town, East London. The first woman was thought to be Mirajan Mustafa, a 37-year-old who had been reported missing 11 months earlier. Now a painstaking forensic search of the flat would provide clues as to who the second woman was.
One of the items we found inside the flat was a ripped-up diary, ripped-up drawings and letters, and a name appeared on there as Henriette. But there were lots of names of girls around the flat in different ways. So, yes, she was one of those names, but didn't stand out as much as anybody else at that particular time. And then One of the officers in my team found that he'd been stopped in August 2016. And I'm thinking, well, that's 3 years, nearly 3 years before this all happened, and that stopped with Henriette Sooks. And one of the ways that we would look at trying to find her would be through the normal systems of benefits or anything else that might be. We couldn't find her anywhere. We did find that that was the last time that she was ever seen or spoken to that we knew as police officers, which wouldn't be unusual. But we thought, well, let's try and see if it is her or isn't her.
Henriette Sooks was from Hungary and was hoping to become a UK resident. Sonia Lynch was manager of a local homeless centre where Henriette was a frequent visitor.
Henriette was really quite bubbly. She was always laughing, smiling, joking. She had a very pretty, beautiful face. She always seemed quite upbeat. She would come into the day centre, good morning. Her situation was she had lost the accommodation that she was in and she had to go to the street. She wasn't working, so she couldn't afford to pay for it. We took a group of clients away. There's quite a few pictures of her sitting, watching, being attentive, and just the look on her face. She took part in all the activities, the team-building activities. That is the most memorable time we have of Henriette, and she was happy, and she took part. And she spoke about what she wanted to do. We were working on getting her passport so she could get a job and get her documents. So she wanted so much more, and she wanted to move forward.
Detectives now believed that they had discovered the identity of the two women. To find out just how they'd ended up in the freezer, they needed to track down the flat's tenant, Zahid Yunus.
My team are still trying to find Zahid Yunus, and we have now brought in other units to try and find him as well. And that research around his life, to find out where he might be, whether it be like a job centre, whether it be a relation or a friend, using the intelligence that we have, that people are going to those locations and trying to find him, being a priority. Still in the back of my mind, I've got to think, is he the killer? But he's certainly going to have an answer as to why there is two bodies in his freezer. So we did find him and found him a couple of days later, staying at his brother's house. And it was then that he came out of that house trying to get into a taxi that he was intercepted by officers and arrested. It didn't go easily. He put up a little bit of a struggle. There was enough officers there. He's a big man. He's 6'4". He's not thin by any means. He's a big lad, and also he was allegedly a boxer. So there is an element of risk and safety around arresting somebody like that. Once he's in custody, you have a little bit of a weight lifted off you. But it's important, again, to think always that, is this the person who acted alone?
While detectives questioned Yunus about the grisly find in the freezer at his home, forensic pathologists were attempting to determine for definite that the bodies were that of Jan and Henriette, who they examined first.
So once the post-mortem commenced, it was very difficult to determine her injuries due to the decomposition. She had up to about 50 wounds. Some of them may well have been stab wounds. She looked like she'd also been stamped on, suffered a number of fractures to her ribs.
If this was indeed the body of Henriette Sooks, it would seem that this wasn't the first time she had suffered at the hands of another.
We found that she'd been a victim of a crime some time before. We obtained her DNA sample from being a victim of crime and compared it against the DNA of the second body in the freezer, and they matched. So we knew then that we identified the second body, and that was Henriette Sooks.
The post-mortem examination would also formally identify the second victim as Mirishan.
There were identifying features of Jan that we could use to try and help us with the identification. It was a tattoo on her body that helped us, which was later then supported by DNA from the family against the DNA of Jan.
Pathologists would discover that the injuries found on Mirishan's body were remarkably similar to those found on Henriette's.
This victim had about 20-odd injuries, again consistent with being punched and stamped. She had a broken sternum, hyoid bones and larynx bones.
But some questions regarding the deaths of Mirishan and Henriette could never be answered.
Both bodies were very decomposed because we were told that the electricity had been on and off at the premises.
Without a clear cause of death, clues about the victims' injuries and when they were inflicted formed a vital part of the case for Met investigators.
If somebody's only just died usually you can see bruising around the neck, which would suggest strangulation. But obviously, with such decomposition, no opinion could really be given. Both sets of bones were sent off for osteoarticular examination. Now, the body on the bottom, when she was identified, we believe that 9 months before this incident, she'd been pushed out of a window and suffered some horrific injuries. So we needed to show that that incident wasn't related to her death now. So in this osteoarticular examination, they were able to show that the injuries that she'd received had been 1 to 3 weeks before her death, therefore nothing to do with the incident 9 months prior to this. The bones from the body on the top, again, were sent off osteoarticular exam, and when they came back, it was deemed that her injuries were received within 3 days of her death.
With the flat's sole resident, Zahid Yunus, still in custody, Simon needed to either charge him or let him go.
My conversations with the Crown Prosecution Service involved talking about what we had at the time, and I couldn't say to them how these bodies had been killed. All I could say was there were 2 bodies in a freezer, and that Zahid Yunus was the sole occupant of the flat. There's no way he would not have known that those 2 bodies were in that freezer. His fingerprints were found on the outside of the freezer. So there is a connection with him in that freezer, a connection with him in the flat. Nobody else seems to be involved. Therefore, the Crown Prosecution Service had to make that decision that there was not sufficient grounds at that time to charge him with any murders. But they were able to charge him with preventing a lawful burial. And that allowed us to have him in custody, because he was kept in custody, and allowed us to continue the investigations as quickly as possible to try and get towards that ultimate charge of murder against the 2 bodies.
While post-mortems and DNA analysis were taking place, police were still looking for clues in Zahid Yunus's flat about the events leading up to Henriette and Mirishan's deaths, and possible connections between them and him.
We also have to be aware that there may be other victims. We have 2 in a freezer, but unbeknownst to us, there may be more. We were now tasked to look at fingerprinting the property and an examination for any blood to see if we could basically intelligence for names. So light source examination, which involves using a laser, emitting different wavelengths or spectrums of light to identify finger marks unseen to the naked eye.
And finally, one tiny fragment of forensic evidence to place Mirishan Mustafa, when she was alive, in the kitchen of Zahid Yunus's flat.
Through our fingerprint examination, we found one of her fingerprints on the cooker door.
As the forensics team delved deeper, the tiny flat revealed more secrets.
It had been redecorated recently, painted, and a new floor laid in the lounge. In one of the outbuildings, there are a number of rolled-up carpets. These were sent off to the lab to see if we could identify any blood, hairs, fibres on them. Once they'd finished with them and came back to the property, we were able to lay them out in the rooms that they appeared to have come from, and quite a substantial amount of Henrietta's blood was found on these carpets.
Other findings in the flat began to show investigators something of what the victims went through during their time there.
These things in the flat with Henriette, which turned out to be her property, had been shredded, ripped up completely. And in fact, over the course of many months, officers put the jigsaws back together with bags full of ripped up bits of paper to try and work out what they were about. Did they have any significance? And in fact, they did, because they were stories that Henriette was saying about how much she loved Zahid Yunus, but also how badly he treated her, the beatings, the controlling behaviour.
There was times where we'd hear shouting, we'd hear windows breaking, things going through windows, screaming from girls coming in and out, police breaking his doors down.
The terrible sounds of these beatings were heard by neighbours in the small block of flats in East London, one of whom was Shauna Woolsey.
There was many times that we heard shouting, coming from inside the flat, with windows open so we could clearly hear who was shouting, women screaming. There was a time when he's shouting outside his window to a girl on the street, or there'd be times where he's outside his door shouting. At one point, he even kicked out a woman and she didn't have no shoes on, and he was at his kitchen window shouting from outside of the whole flat. So everybody could literally hear him screaming and shouting at this young lady.
A lot of people didn't like him. You know, he was a bit of a pain in the local community, always causing problems, arguments out on the street. So people remembered him, which is fine. We know he lived here, but what we really wanted was people to remember him with somebody else. So the community in this area, quite tight-knit. With the people that live here, they remember him as a problem. You know, Zahid Yunus was a loud, arrogant, shouted, argued with people, was a pain to them quite often. So a lot of community members were happy to come forward and talk to us, and those people were able to tell us, yes, I remember him, I know him at the time, and I remember him with certain people. And we had statements, and the community came forward to help us to say, this description is of one of the people, and we were very confident that was Mirashan, that they saw Zahid Yunus with at the time when she went missing.
Still in custody, Zahid Yunus continued to refuse to answer any questions as to what had happened in his flat.
The fact he wasn't saying anything, we had to bring in all that circumstantial evidence around him to suggest that he was the only person that would have been in contact with them. All that information that we brought to the CPS, many months later, eventually he was charged with murder. So we knew that first hurdle was achieved, and therefore we're going to trial, and the trial would be all that evidence together, and we'd continue that right the way up to the trial to gather as much as we could about him, the girls, and previous victims. And bringing those previous victims to court was the next major hurdle for us.
Simon and his team now believed that Mirashan and Henriette weren't the only women to have suffered at the hands of Zahid Yunus. Could these other victims now help to bring justice for the families who had lost their girls? Every week, 2 women are killed in the UK as a result of domestic abuse. In 2020, after months of painstaking investigation, the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Crime Unit were trying to bring justice for the families of 2 of them, Henriette Souks and Mirashan Mustafa. Their bodies had been found in a freezer belonging to one man, Zahid Yunus, and now Senior Investigating Officer Simon Harding had enough evidence to charge him with double murder. The victims' bodies showed almost identical injuries to each other, and now more evidence against Yunus would come from ex-partners who'd suffered similar harm at his hands.
There was a pattern of abuse which I saw, which was a number of them had ribs broken, and mainly down the left-hand side as well. So as a right-handed man who considered himself to be a boxer as well, it was kind of a pattern of his abuse that he would punch people in the ribs. Both of Mirishan and Henriette suffered severe broken ribs down that one left-hand side. Henriette had all but 2 ribs broken. Mirishan had 5 ribs broken, plus the sternum was broken as well. So you can see that pattern of his abuse, and he's willing to not just hit women, but really, really inflict serious injuries and pain to women that he was involved with. He would kick them, punch them, stamp on them, slap them, sometimes threaten them with knives. He would do whatever he wanted to. He considers that women are nothing to him. We knew we had somebody who was really, really dangerous, at the top end of the spectrum of dangerousness of a domestic abuser, or even just as a human being, really. Part of his emotional torture and the way that he would start coercing and controlling these women was to literally lock them away. So a number of stories came out where, yes, he would lock them in bedrooms, take away their phones, not allow them to go out, but he would also take away any communications they had with family members, stop them calling, or sit there whilst they were speaking to their family to make sure that nothing was being said that he didn't want. He would lure them in with buying things for them, and if they were vulnerable, a lot of them didn't have a roof over their head, so one of the things he could offer them was somewhere to stay in exchange for whatever he wanted.
How did Mirishan and Henriette become so vulnerable that they were easy prey for Eunice? Mirishan's family had watched it all unfold in front of them.
The reason Jan did spiral out the way she did, Jan was a single mother. At the time, she had 2 children. So she was a really hard-working mother, supporting both her children and trying to work to support them to make sure they had everything they needed. So while Jan was working, she'd received a letter to say that her benefits, rent benefits had stopped. But Jan didn't really understand sometimes when she'd get letters what they meant. And she didn't give it to anyone at the time because she was constantly working, taking the kids to school, juggling a single life as a mother. She got into a lot of arrears to the point Jan got evicted from her property with her children. Jan then moved into Custom House with her mum. She just spiralled out of control. She started losing weight. She wouldn't have money. She'd struggle with shopping. It just went all out of control. She became addicted to drugs, and basically she was then very weak and very vulnerable, and obviously she was preyed on because of her weakness and her vulnerability.
Increasingly, as Mirishan's drug addiction became more severe, she spent less and less time at her mum's. These disappearances became more frequent until one last time when she never came home at all.
And then Mum would ring me, Jan's not come home. And it just went on from there, really. Panic. Yeah. Panic just started from then. Because I'd ring her phone and it'd ring, no answer. And I'd ring it 10, 20, 30 times a day. Then I'd message her until the day her phone gets cut, or I couldn't call her again.
The second victim, Henriette, on the other hand, was already susceptible to abusive relationships when she met Eunice.
That's when he would begin drawing her into his world. Promises of looking after her, treating her well, all the things that had never happened to her. And he knew who he was targeting, once again, that vulnerable person.
Finally, More than a year after Henriette and Mirishan's bodies were found, Zahid Yunus's trial for their murder began in July 2020.
Yes, when he was arrested originally and interviewed by officers, said no comment. So when he gets to court and now he's going to take the box, everybody is sitting up. You don't know what he's going to say. You know, what's he going to say? That bring in somebody else? Is he going to admit it? Obviously not, because he's gone not guilty. Whatever it might be. But one thing you do know is that anything that's going to come out of his mouth pretty much is going to be a lie. He was immediately disrespectful to the judge, who was a female. She put him straight back in his place, but that's his personality. Very, very emotional case. Jury found it very emotional as well, because you're hearing about the worst possible domestic abuse, you know, victims who have suffered such great pain in their lives. Many have never recovered from the emotional impact that Zahid Yunus had on them. We were fairly confident at the time, as we were drawing to the end of the trial and the jury were about to go out, that we had enough. And then we sat back for 5 days and waited. I can't tell you really how hard that is. It's hard for me. How hard is that for a family?
After those 5 days, the jury found Zahid Yunus guilty of the murders of Henriette Souks and Mirishan Mustafa.
When he was sentenced, it was a relief. Yeah, it was a relief. He got what he deserved. But then when I walked out of the court, it was, I was sad. It felt like I'm not going to fight for her anymore. The end. And I wanted to carry on. Because that's the only way I felt she was near me. By looking for her, by fighting for her, by going to court every day. And then what we was fighting for, he got his life sentence. But then it felt like she was gone now.
Yunus was later sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 38 years. But for his victims' loved ones, the gruesome way their lives ended bore no resemblance to the women they'd known.
I miss Jan all the time, but I watch her videos of us always joking and laughing, mucking about. I've got beautiful videos of her with the children when my girls were born, her bathing them and putting them to bed. I've got really beautiful memories of Jan.
When you love something so much, it's like words. There's not a word for it. There's not a word to tell someone how much you love them. It's holding them. And that's all I want to do, is hold her and let her feel that love from me. And just tell her whatever she's done in life, whatever path she chose, I'm still proud of her.